Handout, the verses we're going to cover are there. But let me just read the first 8 verses of Philippians chapter 3. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you. To me indeed is not grievous, but for you it is safe. So he's saying, I've told you this before, probably when he was with them, and it's not grievous for me to repeat it again. And repetition is good. It helps us to learn. He says, beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision. For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit, and rejoice in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh. So he makes a contrast in verse 2 and 3 versus the true circumcision versus the false circumcision, or the true followers of Christ versus the false followers of Christ. Then he goes on in verses 4 and 5, though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. So he says, you know what, I'm speaking from experience, all right? I'm not speaking to someone that does not know what it was like to have been in that system of Judaism and legalism. He says, circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. So it begins giving his resume as a Hebrew, and a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. So he gave his resume as a Pharisee, and before his conversion, and so last week we covered that. Now tonight we're going to just look at verses 7 and 8. Verses 7 and 8. So the more, and I've kind of labeled this, how did I label this in your notes? Like spiritual accounting. So we got to understand this. The more you advance in a self-righteous religious system, the more you have to lose. And that's what the Apostle Paul was saying. He's saying as far as Judaism, man, there was none that advanced more than him. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews, man. He had the right ritual, he had the right traditions, he had the right, as far as that system, he had everything right. And according to the law, blameless as far as that system, as far as how they viewed things. And he says, boy, I was a Pharisee. As far as being looked up to, he would have been looked up to. And so according to that, he'd gained a lot. He gained a lot in a religious system. So nobody could have claimed to advance more than him. And all the things that elevated him, though, above others in this religious hierarchy, separated him further and further from Christ. Well, why do I say that? Not only did he say that, hey, no one excelled more than me. Well, no one persecuted the church more than him as well. No one was as zealous as he was against persecuting the church. And so, well, the more he excelled in that religious system, the further he got away from Christ. And that is true today. So there's 2 ways we get away from godliness. Unrighteousness, but we don't tend to talk about the other, which is self-righteousness. Both of them can lead us far away from God. And as far as self-righteousness, he was as far away from God as you could be. But in man's eyes, he looked pretty good, according to Judaism. So in the next few verses, or we're going to look at 2 tonight, Paul uses a lot of accounting terms. He acknowledges that those things that added to his religious resume were not only harmful, they created a spiritual deficit. So they weren't only just harmful, he was spiritually bankrupt. We don't think of it that way, though. We think of spiritual bankruptcy is when you're living in blatant rebellious sin. But he was just as spiritually bankrupt as the guy that would be at a brothel getting drunk every night. He was just as bankrupt. But he looked better on the outside. So, and this is in your notes, if you add anything to Christ, it creates a liability on the spiritual balance sheet. If there was a spiritual balance sheet, if there's things that elevate me, that's a liability. It's not good for our spiritual lives. Anything that goes on the me side, the I side, is a liability, is not good. And that's what legalism and that's what Judaism would do. It would elevate man, and that's a liability. So the more self that's in the picture, the more spiritually weak we really are. Spiritually weak. All self-righteousness must be eliminated from our spiritual lives. It's got to be eliminated. It's just as bad. This is what I want us to understand tonight. It's just as bad, and we don't think it is, but it's just as bad as unrighteousness. Because in fact, it is unrighteousness. So it's got to be eliminated as well. So in spiritual accounting, if you want to call it that, look at verse 7. After giving his resume, how much he had elevated in this in Judaism, he says, "But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ." So Christ turns the balance sheet upside down. And I'm sure if you've been saved long enough, you realize that when it comes to being a follower of Christ, everything's backwards from the world. Okay? Everything's backwards. What we think is up is down. What we think is down is up. And that's why our flesh is against it, because our flesh is contrary to spiritual things, and it works oppositely. So Christ turns the balance sheet upside down. So he says, "But what things were gain to me?" Before salvation, Paul considered the things that elevated his own glory as an asset. Those things he began listing. "Though I might have confidence in the flesh, yet any man thinketh that he hath whereof might trust in the flesh, I more." He had a lot of reasons to trust in his flesh. Well, think about that. Those things that make us proud and to make us think that there's something within us that's good that we can trust, and we'll see that we can begin to think there's some sufficiency within ourselves. All those things are really, 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 we ought to go, whoa, 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 I don't want that. That ought to be a warning sign to us that we're heading down the wrong path. Now, a lot of times we don't want to go down that path of unrighteousness because we recognize how that's going to cause us pain. But the path of self-righteousness as well ought to get us to go, whoa, that is not good for my spiritual life. So before salvation, Paul considered the things that elevate his own glory as an asset, and we ought to consider them as a liability. So he says, he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more, circumcised the 8th day. He said, man, I was a real Jew. I wasn't like those that Ishmaelites that got circumcised in the 14th year, or like a proselyte that got circumcised whenever they got converted. No, I was right on the law on the 8th day, and that elevated me above other people, because I'm a true Jew. Of the tribe of Benjamin, that would have been a preferable tribe to be from. That elevated him a little more. A Hebrew of the Hebrews, elevating him even more because of his family that he came from. He had a pure bloodline. As touching the law, a Pharisee, man, he was he was in the right sect. He was going to the right schools, taught by the right one of the premier teachers. Concerning zeal, nobody was more zealous, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. When he says, but what things were gained to me? He says, now I see that those were actually loss. So those things that elevate us above other people are detrimental to our spiritual lives. Those I counted loss for Christ. So in your notes, after salvation, Paul considered anything that elevated himself as a spiritual deficit. It's not good. Okay? That in us, that pride in us, that self-righteousness, that ought to make us just as sick as the prodigal son living in the pigsty. It's just a different kind of pigsty. It's a more polished pigsty, but it's a pigsty nonetheless, as far as the eyes of God. So self-righteousness is not only a hindrance to spiritual growth, it is a subtraction. Remember, there's a path of holiness. There's a way of holiness, and that way is a way of faith. And there's two ditches we err on. One is unrighteousness, lawlessness. I can do whatever I want, okay? And that's going to subtract from our spiritual life. And then the other ditch is legalism. They're both taking us away off the path of holiness. And the way of holiness is a path of faith, which is a path of death to self. It's a path of an exchanged life. And so it's a narrow path. It's not a wide path. These other ways are both wide. Okay? There's an endless amount of laws and rules and all kinds of this. There's an endless amount of things you can do in your flesh. But the path of holiness is a path of death to self. It's a path of faith. So he says this is my paraphrase, self-righteousness is not only a hindrance to spiritual growth, it is a subtraction. It's not an asset. And a lot of times we think the stricter we are, it's an asset, and it's not. It's a subtraction. This is spiritual accounting. Anything added to Christ alone, grace alone, through faith alone, in our spiritual lives is a spiritual loss. And we got to cut it out, get rid of it. So B, spiritual gain comes through loss. That's verse 8. Yeah, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. So he says, yeah, doubtless, without a doubt, or indeed, in fact. This is a fact, he says. This is not just a feeling or something. This is a fact, he says. And I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord. So in your notes, after conversion, Paul now considered anything that elevated himself in religious standing was worthless in relation to a personal, intimate, growing relationship with Christ. Everything else was worthless. All those things that we add, and we think we're adding, and it's adding to our spirituality, it's subtracting from our spirituality. Anything we add to faith, anything that we add to grace is subtraction. Anything that draws us away from growing in our relationship with Christ is a spiritual loss. There's certain things we can add that will elevate us over other men, other churches, other things. But God says those are loss for you. All of those things, and in your notes, all of those things that made Paul great within the kingdom of men, drew him further from the righteousness of God. So he excelled in Judaism. He excelled in legalism. He excelled in man-made religion. But he was just as far away from God as the guy committing adultery. So he goes on to say, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. We must be willing to give up everything to follow Christ. Everything. Paul did not lose anything, though. He forfeited it. Okay? Loss, we view loss as, if you own a business at the end of the year and the number's in the red, we say that's a loss and that's not a good thing. No, he says, I forfeited all those things that were gained to me. I forfeited. I gave it up. I don't want it because I'd rather have Christ. So those things that elevated me above man on this side, I don't want over there the unrighteous stuff, but I don't want this stuff either because I'd rather have the way of holiness, which is Christ. So he forfeited those things that elevated him over man. Are we willing to forfeit some of those things? And do we realize that they really subtract from our spiritual lives? I hope that you're understanding where this goes. So Paul's reputation amongst Jews would be sacrificed to be a follower of Christ. He would have been well respected amongst Jews, amongst that system. He would have been very well respected. He went from that to being persecuted by those very same folks. Probably, or he was, castigated out of the synagogues, which for a Jew would have been very, very hurtful. I'm sure there were very close friends and family that would no longer have anything to do with him. But he forfeited those things that were gained to him. Let's bring it to home today. I'm telling you, I'm sure if you let God examine your heart, there are some things that we know that are man-made laws that have been created, but if we go against that, watch out. People will come against you. Would you rather gain Christ, though? It's much better. It's better. Paul gave it being a wealthy Pharisee to being a hungry missionary. Suffering missionary. He said this was gain. This was good. But he goes on to say, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. Win equals gain. So when we empty ourselves, we gain a deeper relationship with Christ. It's about death to self, Galatians 2:20. As we empty ourselves, we could say, like he said in chapter 1, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So what did he give up? His life, okay? He surrendered his life. Romans 12:1. He gave up his body as a sacrifice to be used by God. He forfeited his privileges in this world. But in return, dying is gain in that. Wow, that's the hope I've been preaching about. Do you see dying is gain? Okay. If not, there's some things we need to empty ourselves of. How about Matthew 16:24? Then said Jesus unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself. I'll come back to what that word means in a minute. And take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. See the opposite? See the spiritual accounting going on here? For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Often we speak of that as like in Hollywood, where they, and this is true too, where they give up any kind of dignity or whatever to be famous and be celebrities. But also it includes anything that elevates us in the religious world is the pride of life. Sure, it's not Hollywood, but it's in man. We want to be elevated above other men. And that's what religion does. It elevates you above other men. And it happens in the religious world too. So that is still the pride of life. So to deny, where he says in verse 24, let him deny himself, that means renounce. Okay? It's not just simply, I deny myself of certain indulgences. No, I renounce anything to do with self. It's a renunciation. So spiritual gain occurs as we lay down all things self for Christ. All things self. We lay down our lives for His life. And this is good. We lay down any sufficiency of our own for the sufficiency of Christ. This is just realizing just how depraved our flesh, just how much even our own righteousness is filthy. And this is that there's nothing in us sufficient at all to serve God. There's nothing sufficient of us to be righteous. Nothing at all. 2 Corinthians 3:5, not that we are sufficient of ourselves, Paul was speaking here, to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. 100% Jesus. 100% by grace through faith. 100%. 1% addition of self is 99% Christ. That's subtraction. Okay? You don't go from 100 to 101%. You go from 100 to 99%. Now, if you add 10% of self, not that it works that way, but you get the picture. You're subtracting. You're not adding. So you add rules, add rules, add rules, add rules. You're subtracting, subtracting, subtracting. Hopefully we see the picture. Humility is the emptying of self to be filled with the grace of God. That's what we need. Humbling, emptying of ourselves. You know what? It's not about me. It's about serving others. It's not about what I want. It's about what can I do to serve everybody else. 2 Corinthians 12:9. Remember when the Apostle Paul had been given these abundance of revelations and that he had gone up to the third heaven, and what would have been the temptation with that? Well, I'm pretty awesome Christian here, man. Look at how God's using me. And look at where I've got to go up to the third heaven. I've got this and revelation. Boy, temptation was to be proud, right? But look at what happened. 2 Corinthians 12:9, he said unto me, because remember he was given a thorn in the flesh, and he prayed 3 times for it to be removed. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. God provides everything to live righteously. Everything. 100%. He says, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, would I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Talking about flipping up things upside down. Now you realize, when I realize I'm weak and I humble myself, I get the grace of God and the power of God. And we try to add something into that, miss the power of God, the grace of God. I'm telling you, the way of holiness, the way of faith, Christ alone, but grace alone through faith alone. All right, so we have about 22, 23 minutes. We'll continue in Philippians next week. I believe we all here have people that we meet with, so let's split up. And don't forget to check out those sign-up sheets, the books. Please take some books. We'll leave them out 2 or 3 weeks, but